All right, guys, back here at Southeastern 16, and we welcome in our special guest, Garth Glissman from the SEC. He is the Associate Commissioner of SEC Basketball, and we wanted to get him on because, you know what? It's the opening week of football season, and our hardcore fans know that there's nothing that Max Barr and I would rather do than talk SEC basketball in the opening week of football season. So probably not a lot of people, Garth, other than us, losing sleep over the intricacies of the SEC basketball schedule, but here we are.
Well, that's why I'm so honored that you had me on, and thanks for all that you do, Blake and Max, to promote the conference and in particular SEC men's basketball.
All right, so let's start with the conference schedule because that's been the big topic over the past week or so. And I know you guys just released the schedule for the 24-25 season. You had a fascinating discussion last week. I know I listened to it with Peter Burns on SEC this morning. And I know this is a very hard question to answer just in one way because there's a lot of things that go into this, but kind of walk us through what that process looks like each year as you start to put together the schedule. I know there's one game in particular we're going to talk about after this that a lot of people are circling in our audience that may take place in Rep Arena in February. But as you go through this entire scheduling process, what does that look like? I mean, how challenging can it be to kind of put this thing together? And certainly you have the addition of two teams now.
I started at the SEC last August and had the opportunity to help develop last season's conference schedule. And so this was my second time around, been on the job for about 12 and a half months. And so enjoyed the process last year. And then this year, as I was traveling to different SEC communities, you come up with ideas from time to time. And so the process for me really started when we finished last year's schedule. And I would travel to these SEC communities, and you get to learn more about the tradition, what makes each SEC program and fan base unique. And so I would keep a running list of ideas that I had that would be exciting to build into the schedule. And so that process went from essentially August of 2023 all the way up until the beginning of this past summer. And then once summer begins, once we get through SEC spring meetings, there are some scheduling related considerations that we want to discuss with our head men's basketball coaches and athletic directors at SEC spring meetings. And once we get clear of those meetings and get some final guidance from them, we begin working with our outside consultant to develop the schedule. And I'm proud of the fact that we used a best-in-class outside consultant at the SEC, the same consultant that develops the NBA regular season schedule. And the NBA regular season schedule, when you think about the complexity of that, 82 regular season games. And then in recent years, you layer on the NBA in-season tournament with the pool play funneling into an 8-team knockout round. So we feel fortunate to have a best-in-class outside consultant to rely on and also best-in-class technology. So the nuts and bolts of the schedule absolutely come from SEC scheduling parameters, scheduling objectives. So I want to be very clear about that. This is a schedule that is designed by people who think about the SEC all day, every day. But we do have the benefit of using artificial intelligence because essentially scheduling is a complicated puzzle or a complicated math problem, however you want to look at it. And so what we do when we start to develop the schedule at the beginning of the summer is we feed our different scheduling parameters and objectives into our artificial intelligence platform, and then it spits out options. And inevitably, it takes time to iterate and ultimately land on an option that has everything that you're looking for in the schedule. And what I would tell your viewers is to think about scheduling as the ultimate balancing act, in the sense that you are constantly trying to balance competitive considerations on one hand. Competitive considerations could mean anything from, the sequencing of your opponents. You wouldn't want one team to play the best teams in the conference, 5 or 6 games in a row. You wouldn't want a team to have its bye after its first conference game. You wouldn't want a team to have its bye after its 17th conference game. We want to have home and away balance in the way those matchups are structured. So it's a balance of competitive considerations on one hand with what I would describe, fan and entertainment considerations on the other hand, because we do want to deliver for our fans exciting games at exciting times of the year, because we live in a competitive environment. So when you think about scheduling and why we utilize artificial intelligence, a lot of it is because it's this constant balancing act. And when you lean into the competitive side of things, you may give up a little bit on the entertainment side or vice versa. And so ultimately, there's no schedule that's perfect, but it's an iterative process that's designed to try to strike the best possible balance.
So you did the 14 team league last year, obviously 16 now. Is it as simple as we're giving the algorithm 2 more teams, or is there a lot more in play now that we add Texas and Oklahoma?
It changes the dynamics in terms of what's hardwired into the schedule. So last year we played 18 conference games with 14 teams. So the way we designed it is that each of the 14 schools played every other school once, which amounts to 13 games because you're playing the other 13 schools in the conference. And that left 5 more games to play. So there were 5 2-play opponents. So last year was a 13-5 format. This year, excuse me, it was with the addition of Texas and Oklahoma now bringing us to 16 schools, we have a 15-3 format, meaning every SEC school plays every other school once, and then you have to get to the final number of 18 league games, you have to have 3 2-play opponents. We arrived at those 3 2-play opponents in the sense that athletic directors picked 2 of the what we call permanent 2-play opponents. So, for example, Alabama and Auburn are hardwired 2-play opponents. Ole Miss, Mississippi State, hardwired 2-play opponents. Oklahoma and Texas, it's hardwired that they're 2-play opponents. Those traditional rivalries that you want to preserve. And then the conference office had the discretion to choose one of those 2-play opponents. Last year, we had discretion to choose 2 of the 5 2-play opponents. This year, we had more limited discretion in the sense that we chose 1 of the 3 2-play opponents. So it's a little bit of a different math problem that figures into the scheduling formula, which is something that a lot of conferences across the country are dealing with as conferences have expanded in number.
You mentioned the balance and again, the entertainment aspect too of things. And, like I mentioned earlier, and, we certainly have a lot of Kentucky and Arkansas fans that watch our stuff. And I think, we were circling, we went back last week and looked at all the games on the schedule, like, oh, that's exciting. That's exciting. And there's a lot of those, but, you talk about the opening game on January 4th with A&M and Texas. Like, that's an exciting game to have on the schedule that first weekend. But I know there's one in particular, like we said, February 1st, you have John Calipari now leading Arkansas to Rupp Arena to play Kentucky. And I know you mentioned this last week, but this is what I love about kind of the thought that goes into these scheduling things. That game happens, it's sandwiched between the NFL Conference Championship games on January 26th and the Super Bowl on February the 9th. And so, for some fan bases, like I said, not everyone, but for Kentucky and Arkansas fans, their Super Bowl is going to take place between the Super Bowl and the NFL Conference Championship game. So what kind of goes into that process? And I think that's probably, you mentioned maybe there can be some challenges when it comes to building a schedule each year, but that has to be some of the fun things too, that you're able to go in and kind of find a way to slot some of those games at different places that that a lot of people are certainly going to have a lot of eyes on.
When building the schedule and living in SEC country, I try to be very realistic about the juggernaut that is SEC football. Right. And then also in the broader scope, you have to be mindful of the ratings juggernaut that is the NFL. And so college basketball, historically, when you think about conference play, when the calendar turned of the new year, early January, that historically was the time of year where sports fans, especially college sports fans, turn their attention to conference play and men's basketball. In recent years, what's happened is the football calendar has continued to expand. The college football playoff has expanded this year, so it'll start December 20th. It'll finish on January 20th. So that's a month where many college sports fans, particularly in our region of the country, are going to be focused in large part on football. The NFL has similarly expanded its calendar and schedule over the years. They now play 17 regular season games. What that's done is it's pushed back the week of the Super Bowl by a week because they're still starting at the same time of the year. There's talk that the NFL Soon we'll go to 18 regular season games, which will have an even further kind of encroaching effect on basketball. So I've tried to be a realist in terms of recalibrating and working with our TV partners, working with my colleagues here at the conference office to recalibrate the SEC men's basketball schedule up against the modern realities of the broader sports calendar. And some of the windows that worked in prior eras don't work as well anymore, because guess what? We're not just playing bowl games on January 1. We're playing, bowl games beginning early in the holiday season, and we conclude with the national championship game on January 20th. So there's new dates that we're going to try to strategically position SEC men's basketball into, and some of that will be a bit of a learning curve for our fan bases. So we were very thoughtful about trying to tip off SEC play with a bang. And if you look at that schedule on the opening Saturday, January 4th, you've got Tennessee versus Arkansas, Florida versus Kentucky, Texas versus Texas A&M. There's consideration given to a lot of factors. Oftentimes, fan bases prefer to play marquee home games when their students are on campus. And that is something that we take into account. But I would just add that in light of the dramatically evolving nature of the broader sports calendar, we have to be open to windows that work better in the new environment than they may have before. And so for us at the SEC, it was really important to tip off SEC men's basketball with a bang. We want to get people thinking about SEC men's basketball as early in the season as possible. And we think an important way to do that is with a really appealing slate of games on the first Saturday of conference play. That's a similar strategy that's used by most professional sports leagues. If you look at what's happening on opening weekend of the college football season on Saturday, for example, you have 3 primetime SEC football games. Then the following day, LSU will play USC, another primetime game on Sunday night. So it's a pretty tried and true approach in other leagues that when you start, whether it's in pro sports, you start the regular season, or in our case, the conference season, you want to create some excitement out of the gates. And so that's what we've tried to do with opening day. And the same rationale applies to the placement of Coach Calipari's return to Kentucky. It's strategically placed, as you noted, on Saturday, February 1st, which is the weekend in between the NFC and AFC conference championship games and the Super Bowl. So we think that there's a little bit of a blank canvas to paint on in terms of attention and mind share in the sports world. And we expect that game to be the biggest story in all of sports that particular weekend. And of course, that perhaps might not be the case if it was played on the same weekend as the Super Bowl or the day before the NFC and AFC championship game. So have to be mindful of where the most strategic windows are and recognizing that those windows have evolved significantly in recent years.
Yeah. Staying on that topic of Saturdays, and now there may be nothing to this, but I am curious. When you get those options like spit back from the algorithm, and you see Alabama Auburn, you get a Tennessee Kentucky, and it's on a Wednesday or something. Is it like, well, let's bump that to a Saturday and get these big time primetime games on a Saturday? Or is where it falls on a normal week kind of just, whatever, it might be on a Wednesday, it might be on a Thursday? Or is it like, we know this is going to be a big game, we're pumping it to primetime Saturday?
So it's, at the risk of overusing the term, it's a delicate balance. And why the reason I say that is you can hardwire certain games and certain patterns into the schedule. But when that happens, the math problem gets more complex because there's less room to put the other games. And we have a lot of what I would describe as competitively driven scheduling parameters. So some of the scheduling parameters that may not be known to some of our fans is that in the first 4 games, 2 of them have to be at home. In the last 4 games, 2 of them have to be at home. Last year was the first year in quite some time that we introduced buys into the SEC conference schedule. And so we're very mindful about where we place those buys. No team has a buy in its first 5 games or its last 5 games. Then you also have to hardwire in the matchups that we talked about earlier, right? That every team is playing every other team at least once, and then they have their 2-play opponents, and there's certain home and away matchups and rotations that have to be honored. So a lot of that is hardwired into the schedule. And then when you start layering on top what I would consider fan-driven or entertainment-driven requests, it just the math becomes harder. So you have to be mindful not to ask too much of the artificial intelligence algorithms, because they can't make an impossible math problem work. So we work with our TV partners to prioritize certain games. If you look at our schedule this year, and hopefully SEC basketball fans feel it this season, there's going to be a lot of big games on Saturdays. We want to make those tentpole events, take the excitement from SEC football and just carry that into January, February, and early March, and create some exciting moments on iconic SEC campuses during the conference portion of the basketball season. But that's not to say that we aren't going to be playing some big games during the week. We have marquee ESPN windows on Tuesday night, and it's really important that we always have a marquee game on Tuesday night to feature the conference. So there's some high level games that are going to be played during the week. But I think if our fans kind of go through the entirety of the schedule, they will sense an appreciation for iconic Saturday games on SEC campuses. We really want to give the people what they want, and our fans are what make the SEC so special. And one way to honor them is, to the extent possible and to the extent that it works with our TV schedule and TV partners, trying to drive a lot of those big games onto Saturdays where fans can really go and make a day of it.
So I'm going to go back to the balance buzzword, because I think it applies to this scenario too. I know it was a couple of years ago, and I know he's talked about it since, but Commissioner Sankey was talking about, when we knew that Texas and Oklahoma were going to join the conference, a lot of people are asking, okay, well, what does that mean for the conference schedule in terms of number of games? And another thing he's continued to point out is that it just feels like it's a good balance in terms of that rotation, which you mentioned earlier, how you kind of structure who plays who, how many times you play a certain team, that kind of thing. Obviously, I'm sure, there have been discussions kind of debating back and forth. What do you sort of anticipate in terms of, is there a scenario where, this, as you know, this is such a changing landscape in college basketball and college sports in general. People are talking about NCAA tournament expansion, all this other stuff. Have there been kind of any discussions you feel like, or kind of what you feel like is your stance now on maybe expanding that conference schedule, while also, and Max and I have always talked about this, the importance just of those non-conference games. And, you certainly have the SEC, ACC challenge, those kind of games built in. But how do you kind of anticipate that looking in the future, knowing that you are adding 2 teams? People are asking, does this mean that the conference schedule eventually gets expanded to?
Well, Blake, that's an astute question. We are currently the only power conference that's playing 18 conference games. Beginning this year, all the other power conferences will play 20 conference games. And certainly in our role at the conference office, it's important that we spot those trends, make sure that our coaches and athletic directors are aware. I don't want to divulge too many of the conversations that we have in those meetings, other than to say that it's something that we're monitoring very closely as we think about how to position the SEC going forward. I want to credit many of our SEC schools. If you look across the conference, many of our programs lead the way in terms of challenging themselves in non-conference play. And I think Alabama last season was the poster child for that. They went into conference play with, I think, 6 losses, but they were all, high-level quad 1 losses. And even in spite of, more losses in the loss column than you would normally expect from a team that ends up in the Final Four, their net ranking never really slipped. And so as college basketball becomes increasingly driven by advanced quantitative metrics and analytics, it's rewarding teams that are challenging themselves, and the selection committee and the computers, and particularly the net, are looking beyond record, and they're looking more closely at, you know, a team's overall resume. And a big part of that is their strength of schedule. So there's a lot of moving pieces when you think about the conference schedule and whether we want to be at 18 or 20 going forward. But I think that SEC schools deserve a lot of credit. And frankly, you've seen a number of SEC schools follow Alabama's lead in that respect. Auburn this year has every bit of demanding a schedule as Alabama had last year. Alabama is trying to recreate the same schedule they had last year. Tennessee historically has played a number of high-profile games in non-conference play. Kentucky always has those high-profile matchups, typically in neutral venues. So our schools are leading the way in terms of challenging themselves. But what I would say more broadly is that I think that college basketball as an industry needs to be mindful of the evolving sports calendar. The popularity of football is undeniable. And as the football season continues to expand, and in doing so encroaches upon the time of year that historically has been reserved for college basketball, in turn, college basketball decision makers need to recalibrate our schedule and find times in the schedule where we can capture the attention of sports fans in a way that's not competing head on with football. So that, I believe, will be the challenge for the college basketball industry moving forward. And my hope is that you'll see the SEC at the forefront of trying to recalibrate and position men's basketball for continued strength.
This may be a very simple question. It may not be, but come early March, SEC tournament time, how does adding 2 teams now change the tournament bracket-wise, timing-wise, start date-wise, et cetera? Or is it just as simple as, we're just adding 2 more teams to the bracket?
Well, I'm very proud of the fact that our conference, no conference has placed more teams in the NCAA tournament over the last 2 years than the SEC. So last year, we tied the Big 12 with 8.
Yep.
The year before, we tied the Big 10. And so over a 2-year period, we're unmatched in terms of the number of teams that we put in the tournament. And also, I would note, and this gets to my point about the strength of schedule and increased reliance on advanced analytics beyond just scheduling. In the last 2 years, we've had 3 SEC teams finish with 8 and 10 records and still make the NCAA tournament. Last year, we had an 8 and 10 Mississippi State team get an 8 seed in the NCAA tournament. Compare and contrast that. 2 years ago, a 14 and 6 Clemson team coming out of the ACC doesn't make the tournament. And last year, a 13 and 7 Seton Hall team coming out of the Big East doesn't make the tournament. So you look at an 8 and 10 SEC team, a 14 and 6 or 13 and 7 team from another power conference. Clearly, the committee is paying a lot of attention to the strength and the depth of the SEC. So as you fast forward to this year, when we now have 16 teams in the league. Last year, Texas was, made it all the way to the second round, had a very hard-fought game in the second round against Tennessee. Tennessee narrowly prevailed. And Oklahoma was, by most accounts, like the first team out. So if you just look at who we have returning in terms of returning NCAA tournament teams, we have 9 teams that made the tournament last year, the first team out. And a lot of the preseason projections for this year suggest that the SEC could be looking at getting 10 teams in the tournament. So this is another area where college basketball has evolved. And I think historically there was certain numbers, associated with, you had to have a certain conference record. You had to be 500 or better in the conference. There were a certain number of losses that you had to avoid to make the tournament as an at-large team coming out of a power conference. And I think increasingly we're seeing that may not be the case. And instead, thanks to reliance on more advanced metrics like the net, the selection committee is looking more deeply at a team's overall resume. And that's why you have teams coming out of the SEC. I mentioned 8 and 10, 3 8 and 10 SEC teams 2 years ago, Arkansas was in that situation that makes the Sweet 16. Last year we had a 9-9 Texas A&M team gets to the tournament, 9 seed, beats Nebraska in the first round of the tournament, and then almost knocks off Houston when Houston was still healthy. Because if you'll recall, as Houston advanced, they really weren't the same team, which is unfortunate for them, because I think that was a Final Four caliber team that A&M nearly beat in one of the more thrilling games of the tournament after a 9-9 conference record. So part of my job, and frankly, Blake and Max, why I think it's so important to do podcasts like this, is to just educate the college basketball community on the strength of SEC men's basketball. And my job, everyone knows about the championship excellence of SEC football, SEC baseball, more recently SEC women's basketball. My job, along with my colleagues and, of course, our 16-member institutions, is to take SEC men's basketball and get it at the same level as SEC football, baseball, and women's basketball. But there's a PR component to that as well. And that's why I'm out here talking about the fact that, you can be 8-10 in SEC play and still make the Sweet 16 of the tournament, or a 9-9 team last year makes the second round, nearly makes the Sweet 16. So the more that people learn about SEC men's basketball, I think the more they'll begin to respect the conference. Other thing that sets us apart, you look at our head coaches. I mean, we got some alpha dogs. We have some absolute alpha dogs. We got Hall of Famers. We've got 6 coaches who have taken their team to the Final Four, and beyond that 6, some really talented up-and-coming coaches. We lead all power conferences in terms of the players that come out of our conference and play in the NBA. So you've got, 6 Final Four head coaches. No conference has a higher number than that, producing more NBA players than every other power conference, and we're only getting stronger. So best coaches, best players, best tradition, best fan bases, iconic SEC campuses. There's so much to be excited about with SEC men's basketball. And again, my job is to take that excitement that defines SEC football and just get that to carry over into January, February, and March.
Listen, I was going to ask another question, but I think that's like our mic drop. Like you just have the mic and you just drop it after that. So that's all we need. But no, Garth, I mean, we could talk for hours. Like I said, we love the game. We know, and I think that's why it was so interesting for us to talk to you, because, like you said, that is your role. Like, as the associate commissioner, you want to be able to promote and sort of showcase like what we all know. And that is, you've seen the change in SEC basketball over the years. And you mentioned, you're looking at a league this year that people anticipate to get double-digit, number of teams maybe into the tournament and those kind of things. And we know it's kind of a new era for SEC basketball and a changing landscape in college athletics. But it was great to catch up with you. I'm sure, hopefully, we can do this again in the future, because, this was really great just to get the insight into where things stand with the conference.
Well, Blake, Max, thanks for both of you to help our great fans throughout the SEC become even more educated and excited about SEC men's basketball.